On this week's episode of Campus Countdown, we'll break down three major stories campus reform covered over the last week, including one event that calls perfectionism and a sense of urgency, you guessed it, white supremacy, an LGBT-inclusive Sex Week event about female orgasms, the latest on the SUNY Fredonia professor who defended adults having sex with children as young as 1 year old, and our woke tweet of the week. We have an interesting show planned for you today, so don't go anywhere. I'm Peter Cordy, and you're watching Campus Countdown. In our number 3 story of the week, we covered an event at Washington University in St. Louis called Is Professionalism a Racist Construct? The presenters at this event made the case that professionalism is this white supremacist construct that is meant to create standards only white people can live up to. They cite a number of examples of what they call characteristics of white supremacy culture in the workplace, including perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, and worship of the written word. They claim that imposter syndrome, which they describe as even though we're working really hard, there's a narrative that we're not enough, is the result of white supremacy culture in the workplace. If you've ever started a new job before, or if you've ever participated in competitive sports, you might recognize a lot of these things and have felt them before, regardless of the color of your skin. But at this Washington University event, they'll have you believe that these are examples of white supremacy culture, even though white people go through the same exact thing. When you start characterizing everything you don't like about the workplace as white supremacy culture, the idea of actual white supremacy loses its meaning. There's nothing inherently white about professionalism, perfectionism, imposter syndrome, or anything else they mentioned. The presenters began the event with a land acknowledgement, noting that the school is geographically located within the ancestral homelands of various tribes who used to live in the region, a growing trend at these social justice events. And before they started the main presentation, one speaker characterized every single black American killed by the police as an example of police brutality and anti-black violence, regardless of whether they actually were, and in fact very few examples have evidence for this, as the vast majority of police killings in general are considered justified, even according to the Washington Post. But that leads us to our second story of the week about an event at Wentworth Institute of Technology, all about the Big O, as they call it. And joining us to talk about it is Illinois correspondent Emily Fowler. Tell us what Sex Week at Wentworth looks like, Emily.
Thanks, Peter. For our number 2 story, Wentworth Institute of Technology hosted an explicit lecture on female sexuality by an organization called Sex Discussed Here. The lecture, taught by self-proclaimed educators Lindsay Fran and Marshall Miller, taught students how they can achieve female orgasm, or the Big O as they called it. Campus Reform obtained a screenshot of a university email promoting the event at the Boston School. The email states the following, quote, "Join us to laugh and learn about the Big O, the most popular topic sex educators Lindsay Fran and Marshall Miller teach about. Orgasm aficionados and beginners of all genders are welcome to come and learn about everything from multiple orgasms to that mysterious G-spot. Whether you want to learn how to have your first orgasm, or how to have better ones, or how to help your partner, they cover it all with lots of humor, plenty of honesty, and an underlying message of sexual health and women's empowerment," end quote. In addition, the webinar made sure to be equally inclusive to other genders. The organization I Love Female Orgasm also has an LGBTQ inclusive webpage that includes testimonials from attendees at past events who praise the organization for making the event also about men. As one student said in a testimonial from a previous presentation of the program, quote, "It didn't make it specifically about women with vaginas. Woman doesn't necessarily mean you have a vagina." I Love Female Orgasm ended the program by giving students a discount code to Early to Bed, a feminist, sex-positive sex shop that claims to specialize in helping people of all genders and orientations explore their sexuality to the fullest. Notice how the word empowerment is used at the end of the email to describe the message of the event. This brings up an interesting question for us women to consider. These educators claim that their lecture, which explicitly and crudely claims to educate us about sex in the female body, is empowering to women. Yet biological men are included as women in this program, and they further criticize the porn industry for lack of genital diversity. No matter how diverse, porn dehumanizes women. This is far from empowering. It is grossly humiliating and disrespectful to women and sex in general. Back to you.
Thanks, Emily. For our number one story of the week, students at SUNY Fredonia are demonstrating against a philosophy professor at the school who has recently come under fire after he was caught on video defending pedophilia with children as young as 1 year old. The students have organized a petition that has been signed by over 15,000 people so far and staged a protest off campus to get this professor fired, as the university has yet to decide whether they will retain the controversial moral philosopher. To give you some context, Professor Stephen Kirshner compared children consenting to sex with adults to the willing act of participating in kickball, and cited examples of pedophilia in other cultures throughout history to justify his view. He says, and I quote, "Imagine that an adult male wants to have sex with a 12-year-old girl. Imagine that she's a willing participant." He notes that he doesn't, quote, "think it's blanket wrong at any age." As creepy and disturbing as that sounds, the professor compares society's disgust for such acts to being grossed out by watching two obese people having sex. After this video was exposed, the university called his comments reprehensible and reassigned him to duties that do not include contact with students as they investigate the situation. Yet, over 20 years ago, he wrote a paper called "The Moral Status of Harmless Adult-Child Sex," in which he defended this exact position. On February 4th, The Fire reported on a letter signed by 153 faculty members from universities across the country in defense of Professor Kirshner. They write, "Many scholars and members of the public will no doubt disagree with his arguments and his conclusions, and some might find any discussion of these issues at all to be disturbing. However, such a suspension from his normal academic duties, let alone any further disciplinary action including his potential termination, is contrary to basic academic freedom principles which SUNY Fredonia has explicitly recognized as governing its own relationship to the members of its faculty." And speaking of bizarre professors, that leads us to our woke tweet of the week. You may be familiar with Leah Thomas, the transgender swimmer for UPenn who has been causing a lot of controversy, even comparing himself to Jackie Robinson. A recent story came out describing how uncomfortable it is for female swimmers in the locker room to be exposed to his male genitals all the time. A feminist journalist named Helen Joyce voiced her concerns, calling this indecent exposure, and noted that, quote, "These female swimmers are being subjected to repeated non-contact sexual crimes in what are supposed to be their safe spaces, with no possibility of remedy." Trans professor and leftist provocateur Grace Lavery was not exactly in agreement. He engaged in a long back and forth with Joyce and others, advocating for the abolition of the crime category of indecent exposure, and tweeted the following: "The violence I'm trying to redress is the imposition of state penalties for harmful conduct, which are usually barbaric in themselves and always inequitably enforced. So in this case, preventing the act you call indecent exposure is less important to me than abolishing cops. So, instead of protecting women, we should abolish cops," according to Professor Lavery. Not only does abolishing the police put women at exponentially more risk of harm, but decriminalizing indecent exposure would disproportionately impact women as well. Of course, this has nothing to do with protecting women, and everything to do with Lavery's own agenda. He even notes that he supports all gender single-use restrooms and that he is, quote, "terrified to use any sex-segregated changing rooms in the UK." A quick scroll through Lavery's Twitter reveals a number of overtly perverted tweets describing graphic sexual acts in excruciating detail, in an effort to create buzz and controversy and perhaps to sell more books. It is astonishing to me that this person is given a platform by UCal Berkeley and is allowed to teach young adults. But if any school was going to give this guy a platform, it would be Berkeley. Well, that's all we have for you today. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out our social media platforms and campusreform.org for all the latest liberal lunacy being pushed on campus.